Hello, everyone. If you missed our conversation last week, I wanted to take a little bit of time to go back through some of the conversation we had, as it's an important introduction to today's discussion on how do we develop the kind of skill required to live out a Christian sexual ethic. Now, the background conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago was about Christianity and monogamy, Christianity and polyamory, and ultimately ending up asking the question, is monogamy or marriage the only moral context for sexual intimacy? But to get there, we went through a series of questions trying to understand a little bit about what is polyamory all about? How does this meet the Christian experience of relationships? How is this different than monogamy? And as somebody who is an English scholar, it's very important for me to notice that I use these two terms, polyamory, many loves, and monogamy, one marriage. And these two things aren't necessarily opposites of one another, which is why I will start off with a claim that everyone is polyamorous. And if you're like, no way, that's probably because the cultural terminology around polyamory right now has to do with the idea of polysexuality, or having many sexual partners. The actual word polyamory means having many people that you love. Does that mean that you love everyone in the same way, to the same level? Probably not. But if you're a parent, you first loved one child, and then if you had a second child, you now love two children. You love them different ways, but you love them both. Let's just say you have siblings. You probably love your siblings in a slightly different way than you love your parents, or than you love your partner. And so all of us have multiple people that we love. Sometimes we call it family, sometimes we call it friendship. Where this question gets a little bit more complicated is when we start talking about romantic relationships, when there's a lot of feelings and intensity and emotional movement and energy that's present, and a desire for sexual connection or for intimacy that goes beyond simple conversation, a mental connection, maybe shared spiritual values, maybe just a shared physical location, but you actually want to connect with the individual. And this is typically where the word polyamory comes into play. But let's take a look at a couple of more terms that might help us be very specific about what we're talking about. So polyamory means many loves, and it's often put into conversation with something called monogamy. And we have poly versus mono, many versus one, and then we have gamy on the one side, which means marriage, and on the other side we have amory. We've already talked about polyamory. Now let's talk a little bit about polygamy, or polygamy, as people more likely say. This means having many marital partners or many spouses. Polyandry means having many husbands. Again, you see these words are combinations. Andry means men, poly means many. Polygyny, which is more common in patriarchal societies, particularly in the Western tradition, is one male having many wives. That's polygyny, and that's what most people are talking about when they say polygamy. Very few people imagine a woman having multiple husbands, whereas we have a lot more pictures from our history of men having multiple wives. And one of the reasons for this we'll get into in a little bit, and that is the patriarchal context, not only of the Bible, but of Western civilization, where women were considered to be property. Men could not be property. So if you were going to have many of something, whether that's many cattle, many acres of land, or many women, all of these things were possessions that a person could have. On the other hand, if you were female, you couldn't really have possessions of many houses, many cattle, etc., especially in a society that passed wealth through the male lineage. So these are some of the terms: polyandry, polygyny, polygamy. Then we come over to additional terms that have appeared since polyamory became a popular part of our society. One of those is non-monogamy. In other words, somebody is saying, no, I don't just marry one person. But what they really mean is, no, I don't just have sex with one person. Ultimately, this is what we're talking about in this conversation. We have non-monogamy, which people practice all of the time in dating relationships. It really becomes an issue once people go through a marriage and now they have an expectation of monogamy, maybe having communicated it, maybe not. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky though, because for some people, monogamy just doesn't just have to do with sexual relationships, sexual intimacy. It could have to do with emotional intimacy. It could have to do with spiritual closeness. It could have to do with the amount of time that you spend with somebody. And I even know for some people, it has to do with only spending time with me. I am the one representative of your preferred sexual partner that you are allowed to spend time with. So say if you're in a heterosexual relationship and you are a male person, the only female that you are allowed to spend time with, that you are allowed to share intimacy of any kind with, is the one that you married. That is kind of how monogamy gets defined in our culture. Non-monogamy means we don't do that in some way. Who knows exactly what it means? But there are ethical and unethical ways of practicing non-monogamy. For example, cheating is a form of non-monogamy. It's not consensual. It violates trust between partners. However, if you're going to do something ethical, this requires openness, conversation, going about non-monogamy in a way that honors the relationship that you already have. There's another term called open relationship, where people will say, yes, I have a close relationship with this one person, but that doesn't mean I'm closed off to connections with other people. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm polyamorous, where I have many loves. It simply means that I don't take these cultural restrictions of monogamy into my relationships. This is where I tend to identify. There is also solo poly, which you might have heard. This means, hey, I am polyamorous, but I am on my own. Then there is polyanarchy, which is there is no one person or one relationship in my life that is more important than anything else. At this point, I think it's valuable to recognize that when we talk about relationships and commitments, we are not just talking about romantic relationships. We are not just talking about family relationships. We're also talking about work relationships, maybe even hobbies. We all have so many places where we dedicate our time, attention, our life force, energy to cultivating and developing intimacy with that thing. Whether that is music, whether that for me is like writing books, creating educational resources. I have multiple relationships in my life, and the more that I add in, the less time I have for the ones that are already there, which means it's important for me to look at what am I trying to cultivate. Say if I want to create connection with another human, but I also have another book that wants to be written. Which one of them is going to get my energy, my time, my investment? So we have another term called polysaturation, which means that when you have no more capacity to develop and cultivate intimacy beyond the relationships that you already have, be they with people, be they with passions, there's not room for more. Now, in our present day, polyamory has unfortunately become a alternative word to mean I'm hooking up without really cultivating any sense of intimacy or commitment with other people. I just want to have sex for fun and no strings attached. Polyamory is an easy way to communicate that because people understand this is often how the term is used. It's problematic though because often when people are just using this as a term, they're not seeking multiple relationships. They're not an open relationship, they're not solo poly. They're simply using the word polyamorous to avoid commitment until they meet somebody who they're very attracted to and now they want monogamy. Polyamory, I think, should not be a term used for dating around because it eventually causes trouble when one or more of the people who are in partnership want to deepen the connection and now pursue some sort of intimacy. A second challenge of polyamory has to do with the phrase ethical non-monogamy. When you're in a cultural context with shared expectations of what intimate relationships look like, who gets excluded, who gets included, what kinds of things do you share with one person that you maybe don't share with another, when you all conform to a similar cultural paradigm, it is easy to navigate. You say, hey, we're boyfriend, girlfriend. Here's the expectations that come along with this. You're not going to be talking to someone else. You're not going to be attracted to other people. You're not going to be cultivating other relationships. You're going to make time for me instead of the books. I've had some experiences, I suppose. Now, if we're going to get rid of some of these cultural paradigms and now say, hey, I'm going to have open relationships, hey, I'm going to practice ethical non-monogamy, this requires the cultivation of some skill sets, be that communication, self-understanding, ability to navigate and communicate your emotions, your desires, your expectations with your partner, and to navigate when those things maybe don't meet. What are you going to do? These are important relational skills, whether you are in partnership with one person or with many people. And so in our conversation today, we're going to talk a little bit more about what some of those skills look like and maybe what we can do to cultivate some of those skills. To wrap up our conversation about terms, though, when I say everyone is polyamorous, I'm using that in the literal meaning of the term, that we all love many people. However, I would imagine that there are certain lines and boundaries that we all have in our relationships. For example, in the early church, one of the things that I learned was that people started calling each other brother and sister. Instead of the biological family being the primary source of identity and intimacy, now the spiritual family was that new source of identity and intimacy. And as a demonstration of that, Christians would kiss each other on the mouth. This was also a way that they would transmit the Holy Spirit back and forth to one another. If you're curious about this, there is an incredible book called Kissing Christians, which provides the research into this practice. And it got Christians into some trouble in their early communities because people were accusing them of being sexual deviants. And in many ways, they were, because they were using their bodies in ways that no longer met the cultural boundaries for relationships. You were only supposed to share this kiss with people who were your family. And Christians are saying, well, this person's my family and this person's my family. What's going on? So the boundary moved and it created some moral and ethical issues for people. How do you navigate that when the boundary moves or when you have maybe a different boundary than someone else? So we all have these lines in our intimate relationships. We all want to cultivate love and connection, probably with more than one person. And it's possible to have relationships, be they sexual relationships, intellectual relationships, even adventuring relationships. It's possible to have them without love. And it is also possible to love people without relationship. We'll have another conversation about that some other time. But not everyone who you're drawn to in love needs to have that time, intention, investment, that connection in your life. But the big question that we all have is not a question about whether we can have multiple relationships. It's a question about where do we draw those lines. And for many people, that line of polyamory monogamy, that line is drawn not around who you can have lunch with, not around who you can talk with and learn with and maybe even dance with and go to church with and develop a spiritual intimacy with and share your emotions, your deepest thoughts and experiences with. Those of us who have been to therapy understand that sometimes a person who is a professional might know us better in some ways than a person who has been sharing the same house as we have for years. It's possible to experience different kinds of intimacy with different people. But generally, there is a line around sexuality. There's also some ambiguity around that line, this question of where does sexual intimacy begin? When I talked about these early Christians kissing on the mouth, usually that for people is part of the sexual experience. That is foreplay, right? That you only share with a romantic partner, right? But what if the kiss in that culture had different meaning than it has in our culture? What if you go to another part of the world where people find that holding hands is a great way to indicate friendship? How do we navigate these differences? So ultimately, the question that we must come down to is one of how do we choose the kinds of activities that we are open to share with a number of different people? And how do we choose the kinds of activities that we are more restrictive about? I'm not going to share every facet of my life in a video like this one, but I will share with people who are on the journey with me, who want to know me deeply. I will not share a sexual connection with everybody who I'm attracted to, but there are certain people with whom that expression becomes beautiful, with whom that kind of intimacy is a way of meeting God. But here's a question. Our whole ethical framework around sexuality in Christianity is built on the assumption that marriage or monogamy is what makes sex moral. If you've been through my book, Sacred, Not Sinful, A New Christian Sexual Ethic, you've seen that there's two primary frameworks that are presented by the Bible. The framework that presents itself on face value is a patriarchal option for sexual ethics, which has different rules for males than for females. For females, the answer to this question, is marriage the only moral context for sexual intimacy? If you were a woman in the biblical world, the answer was yes. Because if you experienced a sexual connection outside of marriage to the person who had bought the rights to that from your father, you were robbing either your husband or your father of their economic value, of their property rights. And this is where a lot of the sexual regulations in the Old Testament come from. Now, we'll talk about this more in just a minute, because while we're looking backwards in time through history, some of these regulations that we read in the Torah, some of these teachings, seem to us a little bit restrictive and oppressive. And that is because relative to our context, they are. Relative to that context, maybe they weren't. Maybe they were actually somewhat liberative. Kind of an interesting thing to think about. Sometimes though, a woman who was unable to support herself in that economy because only males could really participate economically in that society, the female's role was primarily around her sexuality. But you would then sometimes have people who take up the practice of prostitution, which I have another video about this on YouTube if you're interested in looking more deeply into how prostitution is addressed throughout the Bible. Again, we're on this question, is marriage the only moral context for sexual intimacy? The answer for females in the Bible is yes. The answer for males is not necessarily. For males, there is permission to penetrate. My apologies for the explicit language, but this is what the conversation centers around. It's around economics and power. The male may penetrate anyone who is not protected or owned by another male, or even penetrating a male who is not strong enough to resist. There was not a context, or at least this is never mentioned in the Old Testament, of a healthy sexual dynamic between two people of the same gender. It was always a power over dynamic, a rape, if you will. And there was nothing against males practicing this kind of rape or sexual violence in a number of different contexts. What we have in some of the rules, though, is now we're adding some protections for women. And I think this is in fact a beautiful thing, and this starts to draw my attention to the second sexual ethic framework that we see in the Bible. And that is a progressive unfolding, an evolving understanding of relationships, of love and commitment. The Old Testament takes this step in the culture of giving rights to women, of setting up legal codes that would protect them in case they experienced sexual violence, which many of them did, given, of course, this framework that I just talked about. Now, this framework is biblical because it's there. It's biblical because it reflects the patriarchal paradigm in which you have this double sexual standard for males and for females. The New Testament, though, gives us some very interesting things to wrestle with. I am sharing this here for the first time, and I'm still exploring this a little bit, but I believe that between 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we start to see something really interesting. That marriage is not necessarily a necessary requirement anymore. This is partly where Christians got into trouble, because they're treating their spiritual family rather than their marital family as the primary center of their lives. Marriage is no longer required, it is no longer forced, and in fact, there is something better than marriage. That is love. That is intimacy. That is a reconnection with our spiritual family, this idea that we are all one body. And this Greek word for body, which is soma, means either a body as in a group or flesh. And so I could mess with your mind just a little bit and say we are all one flesh. And that would still be an accurate translation of these teachings in the New Testament about Christians being one flesh. Most of us have heard this term one flesh in terms of a monogamous sexual relationship. And I, of course, have another video on this topic. I have not yet published it, so if you're curious, let me know. I can release that. We can have this conversation next time. But the New Testament then gives us this three-tiered presentation. We have lust and porneia, which is being driven and governed by your desires, unable to choose to love through your sexual expression. This impacts you regardless of whether you're single or whether you're married. If you have no control over your sexual desire, you are in this state of experiencing porneia. There is something better than porneia. If you have no control over your desire, guess what? Marriage might help you to cultivate some sense of control. These cultural expectations and rules are quite useful. And marriage is in fact better than lust, better than porneia. Really great, but it doesn't solve the problem of lust or porneia. It is perhaps a way of learning how to move into the dynamic to which we are all called, which is to live in intimacy with God and with one another, as we are all one body. This, I think, is what the New Testament is presenting to us. And I'm not incredibly clear on this whole progression, but you have something better than marriage, and you have something worse than marriage. But something happens around the time that the New Testament is being written, around the time the early church is emerging. You have this Greco-Roman context around sexuality. This is where we get the word porneia from, and it actually has some fascinating cultural uses in that time, which I get into in my book. But culturally at this point, celibacy was seen as the opposite of porneia. And here's why. Because if you're unable to control your sexual desire in porneia, what is the opposite of that? Entirely controlled. And the easiest way to prove that you had controlled it is to just shut it down altogether. And so people who wanted to prove that they were no longer porneia would just not have sex anymore. And this is what 1 Corinthians 7 is, in fact, addressing. Because in this time, a lot of people used self-control and krasis as this idea of, I am able to control my body because my philosophy is so good. Because I believe something true, I am now celibate. My celibacy proves that my philosophy is good. You can read this explicitly in the writings of Josephus, who's very interesting because as a Jewish person, adopting the Greco-Roman framework of proving the legitimacy of his philosophy. So interesting. I'm getting carried away a little bit, but there's one other dynamic here that we need to understand. And this dynamic was written about by an early Christian father whose name was Tatian. He led this group called the Encratites, and you might recognize this term because it's based on self-control. Tatian believed that all sexual expression of any kind was worship of the goddess Aphrodite. The reason for this is that sexual expression was believed in that time, similar to how it is in ours, to be something that is beyond our control. Sexual urges and impulses come over you and you have to respond. In that time, In the Greco-Roman context, it was important for you to respawn because the gods were going to force you into it one way or another. This was Aphrodite's doing. This was, this idea that we have of Cupid shooting these little arrows and falling madly in love. Love, madness, all of these things are semi-connected here. Now, for a Christian who is supposed to be worshiping one God, engaging in sexual activity of any kind showed to a non-Christian that you were worshiping Aphrodite. So if you wanted a Christian identity, if you wanted to prove this, there were multiple reasons why celibacy became the dominant approach to Christian sexual ethics at this time. Not inherent within Christianity itself, but as it responds to cultural expectations. And so you go from these early years of kissing Christians to all kinds of rules and regulations about who is allowed to touch who and when, and looking at this idea of the body as something that needs to be abused, something that needs to be harmed, something that needs to be fought with. All of this is coming from Plato's teaching of the divide between flesh and spirit, of the divide between the spiritual and the material. The material world is evil and sinful. The body is material, therefore it's wrong. It is the cause of all sin and suffering. It is our disconnection from God that we live in a human body. We have this curse that we carry with us, and we need to reject it in order to enter the realms of spirituality where we can meet God and goodness and everything that has nothing to do with the material world. This was Plato's teaching. This is the Greco-Roman context. And as Christianity moves into this context, we see a lot of these things reflected in the writings of Paul, who's attempting to reach an audience that doesn't have a Hebrew context, that maybe has never heard of something called the Old Testament or the Septuagint. Some of them have. A lot of them are exposed to Hebrew teaching, but the dominant paradigm is this Platonic rejection of the body. So to prove that your theology was good, celibacy was on the table. And Paul actually is writing about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 when people are proposing that celibacy should be the state for all Christians, whether they're married or unmarried. And Paul's saying, no, that's not what it's all about. So in our minds, when we go back and we read some of these New Testament teachings about sexuality, again, we're looking at it from thousands of years later, not looking at it. It is difficult to actually grasp the historical, cultural, philosophical context of these teachings. But once we do, it completely shifts the conversation where Paul is actually drawing people back from this cultural pull towards celibacy that existed right away in the early days of the church. He's actually offering a much more liberating sexual ethic than many of us might imagine. God is working within human systems throughout the entire Bible, whether that is patriarchy, whether that is Platonism. The truth still travels through, but if we don't actually see the systems of thought and culture that we're working within, we're not going to be able to understand how the writings, how the biblical authors are interacting and engaging with the world around them, and we don't actually know what we can learn about how to engage and interact with the world around us. And here's the issue that we run into oftentimes when we simply read at face value and pretend like Paul was writing to the 21st century church. Which he wasn't, by the way. He was writing to the first century church, who had their own set of problems and cultural zeitgeist to deal with. The problem when we begin to think that married equals moral is that porneia, lust, violence, abuse, lack of self-control, taking advantage of other people, happens within marriage just as much as it happens outside of marriage. This is why I wrote my book, because we need a new framework of sexual ethics. And what my book calls us toward, and what I believe the Bible calls us toward in its trajectory, is toward love for God and love for one another in everything that we do. So we begin to ask this question, all right, how do we experience and express our sexuality in ways that bring us closer into intimacy with God, with ourselves, with the world around us, and with one another? How do we love God with our minds, our hearts, our bodies, our relationships? This kind of thing takes skill, it takes practice, it takes cultivation. It doesn't just randomly happen one day. Those of you who have gotten married may have been frustrated at one point when you discovered that a wedding ring does not solve all the problems. And this is why, is because it takes cultivation. Intimacy is not something that is necessarily easy. It is something that is valuable. The love that we have for one another is what demonstrates the kingdom of God in this world. Whether you're married or unmarried, monogamous, polyamorous, wherever you happen to find yourself, I think that these practices that we're going to discuss can actually be very helpful in leading us toward intimacy in our relationships. That is, we look at our spiritual dynamic of our sexuality. What does this have to do with our connection with God, with the invisible world? We look at our relational expressions. How does our experience of sexuality impact our relationships? What is happening in our brains and the stories that we tell ourselves around sexuality? And how do we understand this body and the role that it plays in our sexual experience? Because as you know, if you've done any kind of study of advanced or adult sex education, you know that sex is not purely biological, but it is intimately biological. So how do we understand the mind, the body, the spirit, the relationships, all of these parts of our human experience wrapped together in our sexuality? And should we choose, we can intentionally cultivate sexual wholeness, healing, restoration of how God created sexuality. What is the purpose of sexuality? If you still hold to the framework that marriage makes it moral, it is required for sexual morality, as many do, you run into a very interesting conundrum. I was listening to a teacher the other day, and he basically made this case that the only reason people get married is to have sex, because marriage is required for sex to be moral. And it's a really unfortunate argument, because that turns the whole point of marriage into having sex. And marriage, that is an entirely different conversation than what we've been talking about today. We've been talking about intimacy, we've been talking about relationships, we've been talking about sexuality. We have not talked about covenants. And that is another beautiful conversation we'll have some other time. But when God creates sexuality, he does so not as a thing for marriage. Marriage becomes a thing that we place around sexuality in an attempt to help us move in a healthier direction. It doesn't automatically solve the problems of intimacy and sexuality that we all bring into our relationships, that are present in every connection we have, by the way. And so that is why, whether you're single, married, monogamous, or polyamorous, I think that these conversations are going to be helpful. So I'm looking forward to diving in with you in person. I think this video is a little longer than I expected, about 30 minutes, but I hope it's been a helpful overview of what we're talking about, to let go of a little bit of some of the assumptions that we might carry, to get some clarity around some of the terms that we use. Now, if you still have some questions, I invite you to leave me a comment, send me a message. I'm also happy to chat one-on-one about some of these things, and just to hear your story, share my story. We can talk about experiences, because this is a really difficult thing to navigate. I'm going to talk just for another minute about the Bible, because where we live in time and history, a lot of people look to the Bible as a moral and ethical guideline, and the way that they read the Bible leads me to a particular conclusion about what God might be asking for in terms of our sexuality. And we have a very unfortunate case of how porneia gets translated and comes to us through the centuries that completely gets rid of its meaning. So anyway, if you haven't read my book, take a look at that. It will be helpful. But it is difficult for me to say that my experience has been different than what you expect it should be based on how you read and interpret the text. And so that's part of why I'm sharing my story. Part of why I'm opening this conversation is because I think we need to talk about the diversity of ways that we look at Scripture and let it inform our experience of sexuality. So that sounds like something interesting. I welcome you to join us in conversation. We have a small group meeting tomorrow night. I'm excited to see you all there. And I'm also looking forward to further conversation on these topics. Love to you all.